It was really good for me to meet them because I really admired them from the recording work that they'd done. They're definitely from the same school I come from.
The reality about Jimmy Page is finally being revealed. For 50 years, he concealed behind his guitar genius. But secrets are too large to remain buried. Tidbits about what actually transpired on those Led Zeppelin tours. The affairs that ought not to have been. The conduct that even rock stars were shocked by. Hotel rooms had to be bolted from the outside. Girls were kept secret. At 81, Page is now reaping the whirlwind. The music industry is stunned because this isn't the Jimmy Page they believe they knew. Jimmy Page was born on the 9th of January, 1944 in H, Middlesex, in the middle of World War II. His father was an industrial personnel manager at a plastic coatings factory, and his mother worked as a secretary to a doctor. Jimmy's family led a stable middle-class life. He attended Epsom County Pound Lane Primary School and, subsequently, Ewell County Secondary School. It was a safe, normal childhood, and no one would have dreamed that this boy would eventually be instrumental in making some of the biggest and most boisterous rock music ever committed to tape. All that changed when he was 12 years old. In their house on Miles Road, Jimmy discovered a Spanish guitar. No one knew who had left it or how it had gotten there, but something ignited within him. He got fascinated with Elvis Presley, and particularly the guitarists who accompanied him, such as Scotty Moore and James Burton. He also liked Lonnie Donegan, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Jimmy learned to play for himself by listening to records and using manuals. He went all the way back to the blues for rockabilly music and found legends such as Sleepy John Estes, Arthur Big Boy, Crude Up, Muddy Waters, and Howlin' Wolf. Decades later, he penned an account of touring Elvis's birthplace in Tupelo, stating that it took Elvis's brilliance to merge those influences and revolutionize the world. For Jimmy, this was something more than a passion. It marked the start of the musical vision that would consume his life. In April 1958, a young Jimmy guest starred on the BBC's All Your Own as a member of the J.G. Skiffle Group. He was just 13 years old when the episode was made. In his on-air interview, he talked about becoming a musician, but also how he'd love to cure cancer if it wasn't already discovered when he became an adult. At this time, the Skiffle mania was massive in Britain, and here this TV moment was him playing live on television in front of a national audience for the first time. It was a modest move, but it sowed the seed that music might lead him to destinations far removed from his school in Westview. During his teens, Jimmy had a decision to make. His parents had expected him to pursue the more secure option in science, while he was being drawn further into music. He trained at Sutton Art College, but spent more time playing in clubs and on street corners. By 1963, when he was 19, he committed his life to music. He acknowledged he had no idea if he would make it, but he knew he wanted to be involved. By the mid-1960s, Jimmy was one of London's most in-demand session guitarists, working sometimes 3 recording sessions daily, 6 days a week. He could play rockabilly, blues, acoustic guitar, and even harmonica. Producers adored him since he could learn anything on the spot. Other artists referred to him as Lil Jim P to distinguish him from Big Jim Sullivan. This ongoing work not only earned him money, but also educated him on recording and producing music, valuable skills that would serve him later on. Jimmy was frequently booked as an insurance guitarist in case a band's own guitarist was unable to complete a recording. He was hired to play on early recordings by the Kinks and The Who, sometimes without credit. On The Who's I Can't Explain, Pete Townsend did not want him to play, but Jimmy ended up on the B-side Bald-Headed Woman anyway. This behind-the-scenes contribution meant that his guitar was on many classic records, but most people did not know. In August of 1964, Jimmy was just 20 years old when he contributed his guitar playing to the recording of Shirley Bassey's Goldfinger theme at Abbey Road Studio One. He saw her ace the song in one take only to faint after sustaining the last note for so long. It was also the first time Jimmy had worked with John Paul Jones, Led Zeppelin's future bassist. It's disputed whether Jimmy performed on the main tune or only the instrumental, but the recording connected him to one of history's most iconic film themes. During the 1960s, Jimmy performed on giant hits such as Marianne Faithfull's As Tears Go By, Petula Clark's Downtown, Donovan's Sunshine Superman, and Joe Cocker's With a Little Help from My Friends. He recorded with the Rolling Stones, Them, and countless others. In the recording scene, confidentiality was paramount. Musicians would not discuss which tunes they recorded, and Jimmy many times had no idea who would enter the session when they did. These years instilled in him a thorough knowledge of the business and the connections to create one of the largest bands in the history of rock music. When Jimmy Page arrived in June 1966 with the Yardbirds, he was initially hired to play bass. That didn't work out for long. Within a few weeks, he was alternating lead guitar with Jeff Beck, one of the most explosive guitar combinations rock had ever known. Their music reached its peak 10 years ago with Happenings, played in July and September of 1966. The two guitars intertwined in ways no other band had attempted. The magic was capricious, though. Page confessed later that although there were nights when everything went perfectly, others fell apart when the pieces didn't fit. He'd be following the script while Beck went off in another direction altogether. That same year, the band found themselves on a film set rather than a stage. Michelangelo Antoni had invited them to appear in his award-winning movie Blow Up. In one scene, Beck smashes his guitar after an amp blows, echoing Pete Townshend's famous on-stage destruction. The Who had turned down the role, so the Yardbirds took it. Page remembered afterward how dreamlike it was to watch the completed film. They hadn't been invited to any screenings and found themselves waiting in line like everyone else to see themselves projected on the screen. Despite this, the scene did become one of the few filmed instances when audiences were actually able to see the Beck and Page guitar team. By 1968, tour after tour had taken its toll on the Yardbirds. Jim McCarty and Keith Ralph, who had been with them since 1963, were worn out. They wanted to take it easier and play more acoustic folk-oriented music, but Page still wanted to get the band going harder into rock. Their last U.S. performances were at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles on May 31st and June 1st, then June 4th and 5 concerts in Alabama. These shows, eventually issued on a bootleg titled Last Rave Up in L.A., caught a band teetering on the brink. On June 12th, they formally announced McCarty and Ralph's resignations. The final Yardbirds concert occurred on July 7th, 1968 in Luton, Bedfordshire. Before closing that door, Page had envisioned something tremendous. He dreamed of a supergroup with him and Beck on guitars, Keith Moon on drums, John Entwistle on bass, and Steve Winwood or Steve Marriott vocalizing. It wasn't merely a dream. Page, Beck, and Moon had already shared the stage in 1966 with Beck's Bolero and future Zeppelin bassist John Paul Jones. But contracts, tour scheduling, and personal problems destroyed the plan. Moon was unstable, The Who was occupied, and Beck was out to establish his solo career. That dream band never materialized. The failure instead nudged Page toward forming Led Zeppelin instead. When McCarty and Ralph departed, Page and bassist Chris Drew had Yardbird shows contracted. They were not able to cancel without court risk. Page needed to assemble a new band in a hurry, and even went on tour in Denmark and Sweden with names such as the Yardbirds featuring Jimmy Page. The Rush saw him hiring Robert Plant, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham. On October 25, 1968, the new band performed its first official concert as Led Zeppelin at SUR University. They received 175s, and Page recorded the fact in his appointment book. A bland cost for what turned out to be a night for the history books. Robert Plant nearly wasn't even in the picture. Terry Reid was Page's first choice for vocalist. A 19-year-old Arthur Franklin had once phoned one of only 3 things going on in England along with the Beatles and the Stones. Reid was already scheduled to tour with the Stones in America, however, and had no desire to blow the deal. Instead, he recommended Plant and Bonham. That recommendation shaped rock history, though Reid said he never regretted his choice. Led Zeppelin's early rehearsals took place in a converted boathouse along the Thames at Pangbourne. Page had bought it in 1967 for $6,000 from his savings as a session guitarist. There were hardwood floors, a river view, and ideal acoustics for a band that saw blues, psychedelia, and hard rock merged. Here was where Page first performed Whole Lot of Love's riff for the rest, and the instant buzz that spread. Plant's existence had been transformed drastically during those months. He had previously spent more than a year on the streets, in a suitcase, and playing in tiny local bands. Becoming a member of Zeppelin took him from virtual poverty to touring Scandinavia and flying abroad in weeks. The difference remained with him, and some years later, he went on to help homeless charities in Wolverhampton. The Led Zeppelin contract with Atlantic Records on the 11th of November, 1968 revolutionized the music industry. As of the signing, the first album was already completely recorded, and therefore the label had no control